Welcome back to another scripture discovery video. We are moving along in our Proverbs series, and now in chapter 5. I'm actually recording this video in Tucson, Arizona. My family and I are out here, and I think right now in Michigan, there's a foot of snow, and the temperature is in single digits. And I think I'll throw up a picture just to show you what we've been experiencing here in Arizona. The temperature is around 60 to 70 degrees, and we are enjoying our time together. At this moment, Kara took all the older kids to go out shopping, and I'm here at our Airbnb with my youngest son, who is now in bed for the night. So I thought I would take this opportunity to work through this passage, Proverbs chapter 5, and I would suggest reading it over several times. There are some challenging verses, and to be honest, at this moment, early on in the study, I have many more questions than I do answers, which is okay, since this is just an initial engagement with the passage. Now make sure you have the passage printed out and have a pen or pencil and some highlighters, and let's work through this passage together. I think because of time and the length of the passage, I won't read it. And make sure you read this passage several times before you continue on in this video. And with that, let's start with verse 1. Starting again with, "My son, be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding." It seems like each chapter starts with the same pattern, starting with "my son," and then a command. Here in chapter 5, it's "be attentive to my wisdom," and then another command to "incline your ear to my understanding." And here's the reason why in chapter 2, "that you may keep discretion, your lips may guard knowledge." So I'm marking the word "that" and pointing it back to the commands. Be attentive and incline your ear. I'm going to circle the word "may." If you're attentive and incline your ear, then you will, or most likely you will, keep discretion, and your lips may guard knowledge, and I'm highlighting guard knowledge, and it's pretty simple. Being attentive and inclining your ear will bring about discretion, and your lips will guard knowledge. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. I think I'm going to mark that phrase, your lips, in verse 2, and lips in verse 3. This is a contrast. And highlighting the phrase forbidden woman, we've heard of the forbidden woman before in chapter 2. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, her speech is smoother than oil. I'm also going to mark honey and oil and mark speech and connect it to lips in verse 2. Again, this does remind me of chapter 2 with the forbidden woman's smooth words. Here Solomon is unpacking that a little bit more for us, painting a greater descriptive picture of this forbidden woman and her words that she speaks. Smoother than oil, they're sweet like honey. Verse 4 is the contrast, but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. I'm going to circle bitter, and that's a contrast of the sweet honey. I'm also going to make a connection between smooth and sharp, and I guess just to complete it, the two-edged sword and oil. And I think I'm going to highlight that phrase, "in the end." This is a truth that we need to remember. And I think it's referring to the instant gratification of sin, specifically here adultery, but in the end it turns very bitter and it cuts like a knife. It's very harmful. And this principle can be applied to all kinds of sin, of pleasure and instant gratification. And in the end, it leads to some very dark and terrible places. For example, let's look at verse 5. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path of Sheol. Sheol is an Old Testament concept of where people go after they die. There are various ideas of what this looks like, but it is equated with death. And I am going to circle the word path. And I think I'm just going to make a connection between steps and feet. We'll just underline it like that. Verse 6, she does not ponder the path of life. I'm going to circle life. That's in contrast to the death in verse 5. I think I'll highlight the phrase does not ponder. She does not ponder, and she does not know. And I'll just circle the word it. We know that it's referring to life. She doesn't think about it, and she doesn't know about it. And of course, we're going to have to circle the word path and the word ways. And as we look at verse 7, again we see it starts with the phrase, O sons. And now, O sons, listen to me and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Listen to me is the command. Do not depart is also a command, and it's the words of his mouth. I'll just highlight the word words. Remember, his words from his mouth are wisdom. Verse 8, another command, keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. Again, a command, do not go near. Again, we see language of two paths. Let me mark the word way. And again, that phrase, the door of her house, reminds me of chapter 2. I think it talks about the adulteress or the forbidden woman's house and how it sinks down to death. We see something similar again in verse 8. Now look at what verse 9 does. Lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless. Let's mark that word lest. And it kind of refers back to keep your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house. So it's the commands, keep and do not go near. If you do, this is what's going to happen. You give your honor to others and your years to the merciless. I think I'm going to change the color. This is the result of being foolish, right? Not heeding Solomon's words of keeping your way and avoiding the door of her house. This is the result of sin. And we're going to see this again in verse 10. Lest strangers take their fill of your strength. And I'll connect it with verse 9. Which is connected to verse 8 and the command to keep and do not go near. So verse 10, lest strangers take their fill of your strength. Highlight the phrase take their fill and the phrase your labors go. And I'm trying to figure out how verse 8 connects with verse 9 and 10. In other words, how does disobeying verse 8 result in verse 9 and 10? That's the question that I have. And I'm wondering if Solomon is referring to either blackmail, meaning those who know of the adultery is using that against you, or that perhaps you will be found out and you will be rejected by the community and cast away. Those are the first two thoughts that come to my mind. I'm sure that there's others. And that's something we definitely have to look into a little closer. Anyways, verse 11, and at the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed. So I'm highlighting the phrase you groan, and flesh and body are consumed. And this is at the end of your life. Verse 11 is describing regret, which is a terrible thing to experience at the end of your life. This just shows the sharp warning Solomon is giving when it comes to ignoring his commands. And then in verse 12, he goes into a quote, how I hated discipline. Again, I'm highlighting discipline and reproof. My heart despised reproof. I'm also highlighting I hated and my heart despised. And this is going back to verse 11 and the end of your life. This would be a terrible thing to say at the end of your life, that you hated discipline and that your heart despised reproof. And it continues on. Verse 13, I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. I think I'll highlight the word teachers and instructors. It's in some way referring to those who have wisdom. And this brings us to verse 14. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. So I'm highlighting that phrase, utter ruin. And that basically points out the judgment that will take place because of this sin of ignoring the wisdom of your instructors and entering into the house of the adulterous woman. Verse 15 starts with a command, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. I'm highlighting the word drink as the command and underlining the word own, your own cistern and your own well. And then in verse 16, there's a question, should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? I think I'm going to make a connection with verse 15. There's water and springs. I think there's a connection between scattered and cistern, and also the well and the streets. Now moving to verse 17, I think I'm just going to highlight the phrase let them be and the word alone. I think that's the command. Let them be, of course, for yourself, alone, and not for strangers with you. Again, in verse 18, let your fountain be blessed, and another command, rejoice in the wife of your youth. I'm going to highlight the phrase, wife of your youth. I think this phrase, wife of your youth, is key to understanding verses 15 through 17. I believe 15 through 17 is talking about being satisfied within your marriage relationship. And that phrase in verse 16, springs being scattered or streams of water in the streets, is referring to going outside of the marriage relationship to those who do not belong to you. And verse 17 describing them as strangers with you. I think I'm going to circle the word let in verses 17 and 18. They are saying something very similar, and I think it refers back to verse 15. Now in verse 19, that phrase, a lovely deer, we're going to underline, and a graceful doe we'll underline. Of course, these two are referring back to the wife of your youth. Now, this is the time that you pause the video if your kids are around and listening, because Solomon gets a little more graphic. Verse 19, let her breasts fill you at all times with delight, be intoxicated always in her love. We're going to circle the word let, and I think we're going to point it back to verse 18. Because it is saying the same thing, just in a more graphic way. When a husband is with his wife, physically, there is blessing that we see in verse 18, and rejoicing. There's something wonderful within a physical intimacy between a man and a wife that is good and of God. And I love this phrase, and I'm going to underline it. At all times. In fact, it needs to be highlighted as well. At all times, that you can take pleasure and rejoice in your spouse. Let's highlight the word delight. And here is a great command as well. Be intoxicated. And again, we'll highlight the word always. And let's also underline it. Now also highlight the word love. Love and delight. Rejoice is similar. And let's continue on, verse 20. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? So this is in contrast with verses 18 and 19. I'm going to highlight the phrase be intoxicated. This is in contrast to verse 19. We'll also circle the phrase my son and highlight the phrase forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress. And let's also highlight the word adulteress. I think we can highlight the word embrace as well. And here's the answer to that question. Verse 21, for, and this is answering the question in verse 20, a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. All right, I'm just going to circle the word ways and paths, and I'm going to highlight the phrase eyes of the Lord and the word he ponders. And this is showing that there is no way to get away from the Lord. We may think we hide our sin well, but the eyes of the Lord are upon our ways, and he ponders all of our paths. Nothing is hidden from him. Solomon is giving his son the reason why verse 20 is so dangerous. Remember that Solomon is the son of Bathsheba, and I'm sure he knows the story of his father David. And at one point, Nathan the prophet exposes his father David for the sin that he committed by taking another man's wife. He also knows the ramifications of this evil act. The kingdom of Israel was almost ripped from David's hands by his son Absalom. It's a very sad story, and I'm sure Solomon knows it very well. All that to say, this is a very strong warning from Solomon, and it's something we really need to take seriously. All right, verse 22. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. Let's highlight iniquities and the phrase ensnare him. Also the phrase held fast and cords of his sin. And we'll also highlight sin. Let me just quickly make these connections. I believe verse 22 reveals the principle of the enslavement that takes place when we fall into sin and iniquity. We believe that freedom takes place when we do what we want to do, when we want to do it. But in fact, when we go down that path, we fall into the trap of the evil one and we become enslaved. True freedom comes when we humble ourselves and follow the path of wisdom. All right, last verse, verse 23. He dies for lack of discipline. I'm highlighting the phrase he dies, also lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. I'm highlighting he is led astray and also great folly. And again, I think there's a pattern, just like verse 22. All right, let's go back to the top and figure out how we will structure this passage. Now, I know in some previous chapters, I structured them by finding parallelisms among the verses. And as I continue on studying the Proverbs, and especially looking at Proverbs chapter 5, I don't think that was the best way to structure it. And I'm finding more and more that phrase, my son, is very helpful in finding the structure in these chapters. In verse 1, we see the command to be attentive to wisdom and incline your ear to understanding. And the reason is, in verse 3, Solomon wants his son to be aware and be wary of the forbidden woman and the dangers that will come if he gets involved with this forbidden woman. That basically finishes up in verse 6. So I think verses 1 through 6 is the first section, giving us commands and introducing the forbidden woman. And now we see in verse 7, it starts with the phrase, O sons, and then a couple of commands to listen and do not depart from the words of my mouth. And in verse 8, to keep your way far from her and to not go near. And verse 9 and 10, if you don't do this, there's some dangers. And you see that continue on all the way to verse 14. So 7 through 14, I think, is another section. And that gets us to verse 15 with another command, and that is to drink water from your own cistern. And of course, we know this is referring to your wife of your youth in verse 18, and it gives a greater description in verse 19. So I'm going to make the next section verses 15 through 19. And that brings us to the last section, verses 20 through 23. All right, I don't think this is perfect. In fact, I think you could probably make a good argument that the last section is actually just 22 and 23, and the section starting in verse 15 may go all the way down to verse 21. I think that is another option, which means that verses 22 and 23 may be a summary of what Solomon is communicating in Proverbs chapter 5. However, we're going to call this good and come back to the beginning of the Proverbs and point out two truths that I think are very important to consider as we think through Proverbs chapter 5. The first one we find in verses 3 through 5, and that is the dangers of instant gratification, especially when it comes to adultery and believing the lie that it will satisfy you. But take a look at verse 4. In the end, she is bitter and sharp as a two-edged sword. And here's the scary truth in verse 5. Her feet go down to death. I think that's something Solomon wants us to take seriously. Also, verses 15 through 19, and the wonder and beauty and the blessedness of marriage is described in these verses. I think that's something we need to consider as well. And then last, in verse 21, knowing that we cannot keep our sin hidden from the eyes of the Lord. He sees our ways, and He understands or ponders all of our paths. That should cause us to pause when we are ensnared in temptation. Now, there's a lot of other important truths in this passage. For me, those are just three that jump out at this moment. All right, I think that just about does it for our time together. Remember that we will be talking through this passage on Sunday morning for Sunday school class. At Sawyer, Sunday school starts at 9 a.m., and at the Converge site, our Sunday school starts at 10 a.m. I would encourage you all to attend one of those classes. I think we would have some wonderful discussion on this chapter. There are so many important truths to draw out in this chapter, and I think it'll make for great discussion. And with that, may God bless you, and we'll see you next time.